Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh was not merely weather. It was a persistent, damp character that had lived in the village longer than any of its inhabitants. It was a fine, grey drizzle that blurred the line between the sky and the dark waters of the sea loch, turning the towering peaks of the Sutherland Mountains into ghostly, looming giants. On this particular Tuesday morning, PC Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite duty, avoiding it entirely. Hamish sat in the kitchen of his small police station house, his long, lanky frame draped over a wooden chair. His shock of copper-red hair was ruffled, and his hazel eyes were fixed with intense concentration on the blue smoke curling from his peat stove. Beside him, Lugs, his scruffy West Highland terrier with one ear that stood up and another that flopped over like a pancake, let out a long, contented sigh. "There's a fine art to doing nothing, Lugs," Hamish murmured, reaching for a thick ceramic mug of coffee. "Headquarters thinks I'm out patrolling the glens, but the glens have been there for millions of years. I doubt they'll wander off if I stay inside for one more pot of brew." However, peace was fragile. It was shattered by the high-pitched, self-important chime of the telephone. Hamish eyed the instrument with the wary suspicion one might reserve for a poisonous snake. He let it ring 6 times, long enough to suggest he was sprinting from the far corner of the garden, but short enough to avoid a formal reprimand. "Lochdubh Police Station, Constable Macbeth speaking," he drawled, his Highland lilt thick and deceptively slow. "Macbeth, why the devil did it take you so long?" barked a voice that sounded like gravel in a blender. It was Sergeant McGregor from Strathbane. "Stop daydreaming about salmon and get down to the Gilded Thistle. We've had a complaint from the new proprietor, Mrs. Penelope St. John Smythe. She says someone is harassing her establishment." Hamish sighed. Mrs. St. John Smythe was the latest Sassenach to descend upon the village, with more money than sense. She had purchased the old, charmingly dusty village tea-room and transformed it into a temple of minimalist high fashion, serving tiny cucumber sandwiches at prices that made the local fishermen cross themselves. She had already rubbed the village the wrong way by suggesting that Archie MacLean's daily presence was detrimental to the aesthetic. "Harassment, you say?" Hamish asked, scratching his chin. "Is it the seagulls again? They can be very persistent about the scones." "It's not seagulls, you fool." She claims the locals are staging a silent protest by staring through the window while she serves her London guests. Just go down there, look official, and try not to get any dog hair on her white upholstery. Hamish hung up and looked at Lugs. "Duty calls, lad. Though I suspect harassment in Lochdubh usually translates to someone didn't say hello in the post office." He pulled on his heavy, slightly oversized police tunic and stepped out into the drizzle. As he ambled toward the village centre, he noticed a flashy, silver Mercedes-Benz parked crookedly across the pavement. It was a car that screamed of city traffic and impatient deadlines, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of weed-strewn stone walls. The Gilded Thistle was buzzing, but not with the usual pleasant hum of village gossip. Mrs. St. John Smythe, a woman with skin pulled as tight as a drum and a voice like a silver whistle, was standing on the doorstep, her face a mask of pinched fury. "Constable, finally!" she exclaimed, her English accent clipping every syllable like a pair of garden shears. "It's intolerable. I moved to this wilderness for peace, and what do I find? Malice, sabotage. Someone has placed a dead crow on the doorstep of my tea room. It's a barbaric Highland hex, isn't it?" Hamish looked down at the soggy bundle of black feathers near her designer shoes. He knelt, poking it gently with a blade of grass. "Ah, well, now, Mrs. St. John Smythe, it looks more like it flew into the window. These modern panes are very clean, you see. The birds don't always notice them." "Nonsense," she snapped, "and look at them." She pointed across the road, where a row of elderly villagers, led by the formidable Mrs. Kennedy, were standing silently under their umbrellas, watching the tea-room with the unwavering gaze of owls. "They've been there for an hour. It's chilling." "They're just waiting for the bus, ma'am," Hamish said mildly, though he knew perfectly well the bus wasn't due for 3 hours. The villagers didn't like the new prices, and more importantly, They didn't like being told that their tweed jackets clashed with the decor. "Well, do something," she commanded. "I have the Honourable Mr. Vane Tempest arriving for tea in 20 minutes. I will not have him greeted by omens of death and staring at peasants." Hamish stood up, his face a picture of gormless cooperation. "I'll move the bird, ma'am, and I'll have a stern word with the bus stop people." Perhaps they could stare at the sea lock for a bit instead. As he picked up the crow, Hamish glanced through the large glass window of the tea room. Inside, tucked away in the far corner booth, sat a local man named Peter Ness. Peter was the village's unofficial information bureau, a man who made his living by knowing exactly whose daughter was pregnant and whose husband was paying the rent money. He was currently staring into a cup of Earl Grey, but he wasn't moving. In fact, he looked remarkably still. Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the Sutherland rain. He pushed past the protesting Mrs. St. John Smythe and entered the pristine white room. "Mr. Ness," Hamish said softly. There was no answer. Peter Ness was slumped slightly forward, his forehead resting against the edge of a delicate china saucer. A single dark drop of something that wasn't tea had stained the white lace tablecloth. Hamish sighed, a deep, tired sound. His quiet morning was officially over. He looked at Mrs. St. John Smythe, who was still complaining about the local atmosphere in the doorway. "I'm afraid the atmosphere is about to get a lot heavier, ma'am," Hamish said, his voice losing its sleepy quality. "You'd best call the hotel. Tell them the tea room is closed, and tell them to send strong coffee. It's going to be a very long day." Mrs. St. John Smythe's initial indignation dissolved into a series of sharp, rhythmic gasps that sounded like a punctured bellows. She clutched the back of a pristine, spindle-legged chair, her knuckles turning as white as the minimalist walls. "Dead? He can't be dead. He only just ordered a slice of my organic lemon drizzle cake. It's horribly middle class to die in a public tea room." Hamish ignored her theatrics, his gaze fixed on Peter Ness. He didn't touch anything. He knew the rules of the game, even if he found them tiresome. He noticed that Peter's hand was still curled loosely around the handle of his teacup, but the liquid inside was cold and undisturbed. The dark drop on the tablecloth was not blood as one might expect in a more violent corner of the world, but a viscous greenish smear that smelled faintly of almond and something bitter like crushed laurel leaves. "Right then," Hamish said, his voice dropping into that low, deceptively calm register he used when things took a turn for the grim. "Lugs, stay." The dog sat obediently by the door, his nose twitching at the scent of expensive cake and sudden mortality. Hamish walked behind the counter, ignoring the owner's protests, and picked up the telephone. He didn't call the village doctor first. He called the station in Strathbane. He knew that if he delayed the report by even 5 minutes, Blair would use it as an excuse to claim Hamish was tampering with the evidence to protect a local. While the line rang, Hamish's eyes scanned the room. The gilded thistle was empty of other customers, but the back door to the kitchen was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the draught. Through the gap he could see the legs of the kitchen maid, a local girl named Mary, who was currently hiding behind a stack of flour sacks, her sobs muffled by her apron. "Macbeth, is that you again?" Sergeant McGregor's voice barked through the receiver. "Aye, Sergeant, you can tell the DCI to cancel his lunch plans. We've got a body in the tea room, Peter Ness, and unless he's decided to stop breathing as a personal favour to the neighbourhood, I'd say he's been sent on his way." The silence on the other end lasted only a heartbeat before the line erupted into a flurry of shouted orders and the distant wail of a siren being tested. Hamish hung up and turned back to Mrs. St. John Smythe. "Ma'am, I need you to step into the back with Mary. Don't touch any of the cups, and for the love of all that's holy, don't try to clean that table." "But the Honourable Mr. Vane Tempest," she wailed, her priorities as skewed as ever. "He's coming for the artisanal infusion. The Honourable Mr. Vane Tempest can drink rainwater for all I care," Hamish said with a rare flash of steel. "There's a man dead in your corner booth, and until I'm told otherwise, this tea room is a crime scene." He ushered the trembling woman into the kitchen, then returned to the main room. He stood there, a solitary, unkempt figure in a room designed for people far wealthier and more impatient than himself. He looked at Peter Ness. Peter had been a man living on the currency of secrets. He knew who was dipping into the Kirk's collection plate and which of the summer visitors was conducting an affair in the dunes. To see him silenced in such a public, humiliating fashion, face down in a saucer of Earl Grey, was a dark irony that wasn't lost on Hamish. The drizzle outside had intensified, blurring the glass of the tea-room windows. The row of villagers across the road hadn't moved. If anything, their numbers had grown. Word had clearly travelled through the Lochdubh grapevine with its usual supernatural speed. They knew something had happened before the police sirens even reached the village limits. Hamish pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. He noted the position of the body, the half-eaten cake, and the peculiar green smear. He also noticed something else. Peter's pocket was turned slightly outward, as if someone had reached in and removed something in a hurry. Peter never went anywhere without his black book, a small ledger where he supposedly kept the dates and details of his most lucrative discoveries. The book was nowhere to be seen. The sound of screeching tires and a chorus of sirens suddenly cut through the Highland mist. A fleet of white police cars, led by a black sedan that looked like an angry beetle, swerved onto the pavement, narrowly missing the villagers' umbrellas. DCI Blair was here, and the piece of Lochdubh was about to be replaced by the blustering, red-faced incompetence of Strathbane's finest. Hamish took a final deep breath of the relatively calm air. He looked at Lugs and gave a weary shrug. "Well, lad, here comes the circus. Try not to let Blair trip over ye. He's in a foul enough mood as it is." The door of the black sedan flew open with such violence that it nearly clipped the silver Mercedes belonging to Mrs. St. John Smythe. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face already a magnificent shade of overripe plum. He did not walk so much as charge toward the tea-room, his heels clicking aggressively on the wet pavement. Behind him trailed a small army of detectives and forensic technicians, all looking as though they would rather be anywhere else than in the middle of a Sutherland drizzle. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed before he was even halfway through the door. "Stand away from that body. Every time I turn my back, you're standing over a corpse like a vulture over a carcass. What have you done to the evidence? Have you been sitting on it? Have you been eating the victim's cake?" Hamish remained standing by the counter, his expression one of polite, vacant bewilderment. He didn't move an inch as Blair stormed into the white-on-white sanctuary of the Gilded Thistle. "I haven't touched a crumb, sir. I was just making sure the dog didn't get too close to the biscuits. It's a sad business, truly. Peter Ness was a fixture of the village." "A fixture of the village? He was a professional nuisance," Blair snapped, looking at Peter Ness's slumped form. He didn't look for puncture wounds or signs of struggle. Instead, he immediately began to huff with self-importance. "Look at this. No sign of a struggle, clearly a heart attack. The man was probably 80 years old and lived on a diet of fried fat and local spite. Case closed. Now get these people away from the window before I have them all arrested for obstruction." "He's only 62, sir," Hamish offered mildly, staring at the floor. "And he was quite a fitness enthusiast. I walked 10 miles a day, just to make sure he didn't miss any gossip at the outlying farms." Blair turned on him, his eyes bulging. "I don't care if he ran marathons in his kilt. Look at the scene, Macbeth. It's a clean room. It's a peaceful death. It's a heart attack brought on by that ridiculous lemon cake." He gestured toward the kitchen, where Mrs. St. John Smythe was currently being interrogated by a junior detective. "Who's the owner? That Englishwoman? I'll bet she's been using industrial-strength sugar." Hamish cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "There's a peculiar green smear on the tablecloth, sir, near the saucer. Smells a bit like almonds, it does. I thought perhaps the forensics boys might want to have a look-see before we write it off as the cake." Blair leaned down, his nose inches from the table. He sniffed loudly, then recoiled. "Almonds? Cyanide? Don't be ridiculous. This isn't an Agatha Christie novel, you ginger-haired peasant. It's probably just some of that artisanal muck she serves. Matcha tea or some such nonsense." He straightened his tie, looking immensely pleased with his own logic. "In fact, I know exactly what happened. Ness came in here to blackmail the lady. We all know he was a leech. And the shock of her refusing to pay up stopped his heart. It's a clear-cut case of natural causes triggered by criminal intent. And his black book, sir? Hamish asked, his voice barely a whisper. The one he kept all his secrets in. It's missing from his pocket. Blair froze, his face twitching. He hated it when Hamish noticed things. Lost it or dropped it in the heather on the way here. We'll find it when we search his house. Now, Macbeth, you are officially sidelined. I want you outside directing traffic. And keep that mutt of yours away from the forensic van. I won't have the crime scene contaminated by flea-bitten Highland curs. Hamish nodded obediently, his face a mask of dull compliance. As you say, sir, traffic duty it is. It'll be a grand change of pace to watch the rain fall on the cars instead of the sheep. He whistled for lugs and walked toward the door. As he passed the forensic team, who were busy laying out their yellow tape, he caught the eye of one of the younger technicians, a lad who hadn't yet been completely broken by Blair's temperament. Hamish gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod toward the green smear on the table. Once outside, the cool air felt refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of Blair's ego. The villagers were still there, their umbrellas huddled together like a crop of giant mushrooms. Hamish didn't start directing traffic. There wasn't any. Instead, he leaned against the stone wall of the post office, pulled his cap low over his eyes and began to watch. He knew that Blair would spend the next 3 hours bullying Mrs. St. John Smythe and looking for a paper trail that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the real story wasn't in the tea room. It was in the whispers of the people who had been watching Peter Ness long before he ever sat down for his final cup of tea. The heavy thud of the tea room door closing behind Hamish felt like the slamming of a book on Blair's common sense. The DCI was currently shouting at a forensic photographer about the proper angle for a lemon cake, his voice carrying quite clearly through the damp Highland air. Hamish, however, had moved. He stood for a moment on the pavement, the rain dripping off the peak of his cap, looking for all the world like a man who had forgotten why he had come outside in the first place. Luggs sat at his feet, shaking water off his coat with a vigorous rattle of his tags. "Traffic duty, Luggs," Hamish murmured, eyeing the empty, glistening road. "A heavy responsibility. We must ensure that no passing tractors are overwhelmed by the excitement." Instead of standing in the middle of the road, Hamish ambled toward the post office and general store. Mrs. Kennedy was still there, her umbrella held like a weapon of war. She watched Hamish approach with a keen, hawk-like intensity. She had known Hamish since he was a boy, and she was one of the few who suspected that the glazed look in his eyes wasn't due to a lack of intellect, but rather a surfeit of patience. "So the bureau has been closed down, has it, Hamish?" she asked, her voice as crisp as a fresh head of cabbage. "I saw them bringing out the yellow tape." "A bit late for Peter Ness, I'd wager." "Aye, Mrs. Kennedy. A sad day for the information trade," Hamish replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Blair thinks it was his heart, but Peter always looked healthy enough when he was climbing over fences to see who was visiting the schoolteacher after dark." Mrs. Kennedy snorted. "His heart was as black as a coal cellar and twice as hard. But he was at the shop this morning, Hamish. He was in a fine mood, bragging about a big catch he'd made. Said he was going to the Gilded Thistle to finalize a contract. He was clutching that black book of his as if it were the Holy Bible." Hamish's ears pricked up. A contract? Did he say with whom? He didn't need to. He was looking across the road at the hotel, at that flashy newcomer, the one with the silk scarves and the car that looks like a silver bullet. Mr. Julian Vane Tempest. Hamish nodded slowly. Vane Tempest was the honourable guest Mrs. St. John Smythe had been so frantic about. He was a man who claimed to be looking for investment opportunities in the Highlands, but so far, his only investment seemed to be in the hotel's finest malt and the local lady's patience. "I think I'll just pop into the curry shop," Hamish said, touching his cap. "I'm feeling a bit hollow." He made his way to the Spice of Lochdubh, where Mr. Patel was currently polishing a copper tandoor. The shop was empty, the village having retreated indoors to discuss the morning's excitement. Hamish sat at the small counter, and without a word, Mr. Patel slid a plate of onion bhajis, and a steaming mug of tea toward him. "It is a bad business, Constable," Patel said, leaning on the counter. "Peter Ness was here yesterday. He wanted to know about the hotel deliveries. He was very interested in the special parcels arriving for Mr. Vane Tempest. He thought they were, how do you say, not just clothes." Hamish popped a bhaji into his mouth, the spices warming his throat. "What did he think they were, Mr. Patel?" "He thought they were antiques, or perhaps things that shouldn't be in a suitcase at all. He said he'd seen Vane Tempest meeting a man down by the old jetty at midnight, a man with a van from Glasgow." Hamish sipped his tea, his mind churning behind his sleepy mask. Peter Ness had been playing dangerous. Blackmail was a profitable business in a small village, but when you started poking your nose into midnight meetings and Glasgow vans, you moved out of the realm of village gossip and into something much darker. The green smear on the table came back to him, the bitter smell of almonds. It wasn't just a heart attack. Someone had realized that Peter Ness knew too much, and they had silenced the Information Bureau in the middle of his favorite morning ritual. "Thank you for the tea, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, sliding a few coins across the counter. "It's a fine thing to have a friend who listens as well as you do." He retreated into the rain. He needed to find Priscilla. She would know about Vane Tempest's background. She had a way of cutting through the upper-class nonsense that Hamish often found baffling. As he turned toward the hotel, he saw Blair's red face pressed against the tea-room window, still shouting at a technician. Hamish smiled. Let Blair hunt for heart attacks. He was going to hunt for a killer who used a silver bullet and a green poison. The rain had thickened into a grey curtain, turning the loch into a churning cauldron of leaden water as Hamish trudged toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. Luggs trotted beside him, his tail low, clearly sharing his master's desire for a warm hearth and an absence of shouting inspectors. The hotel, with its rugged stone walls and baronial pretensions, stood as a sanctuary for the wealthy and the weary. Hamish shook his dripping cap outside the heavy oak doors before slipping into the foyer, where the scent of expensive floor wax and wood smoke greeted him. He didn't have to look far for Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was seated in a high-backed wing chair near the fireplace, looking as cool and elegant as a winter morning in a charcoal cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. She was reading a slim volume of poetry, but her eyes immediately flicked toward the damp policeman as he approached. "I hear the village has lost its most dedicated eavesdropper, Hamish," she said, her voice a soothing contrast to Blair's abrasive bark. "And I hear the DCI is currently trying to arrest a lemon drizzle cake for manslaughter." Hamish slumped into the chair opposite her, his long legs stretching toward the fire. "Aye, Blair's in a grand state. He's decided Peter Ness died of a poor diet and a bad conscience. But there was a smell about that table, Priscilla, a bitter, sharp smell like crushed laurel. And Peter's black book is missing. A man like that doesn't misplace his pension." Priscilla closed her book, her expression sharpening. "If it's poison, then you're looking for someone with a very steady hand and a great deal to lose. This isn't the work of a local with a grudge, Hamish. A Highlander would have used a heavy boot or a blunt word. This is sophisticated. That's what's worrying me," Hamish admitted, leaning forward as the heat began to draw the dampness from his tunic. "Mr. Patel tells me Peter was very interested in the Honourable Mr. Vane Tempest. Mentioned midnight meetings at the jetty and parcels from Glasgow. What do you know of him? He's supposed to be of your world after all." Priscilla sighed, a small puff of aristocratic disdain. "Julian Vane Tempest is honourable, only by the grace of a distant cousin's title and a very expensive solicitor. He's what my father would call a wrong-un. He was involved in a rather nasty business regarding forged antiquities in London 2 years ago. Nothing was proven, of course, but he's been persona non grata in the better clubs ever since. He's here because he's running out of places to hide, Hamish. And if Peter Ness found out he was using Lochdubh as a transit point for stolen goods, Julian wouldn't hesitate to remove the obstacle." "Stolen goods," Hamish mused. his mind picturing the Glasgow van. It would explain the midnight visits. But how did he get the poison into the cup? Peter was a suspicious man. He wouldn't have let a stranger near his tea. He wouldn't have to be a stranger, Priscilla pointed out, her eyes narrowing as she watched a figure descend the grand staircase. He only had to be someone Peter thought he was winning against. A blackmailer is never more vulnerable than when he thinks his victim is about to pay up. Hamish followed her gaze. Descending the stairs with practised, oily grace was Julian Vane Tempest. He was a man in his late 30s, with a chin that was slightly too small and eyes that were slightly too close together, dressed in a shooting jacket that had never seen a day's sport. He looked over at Hamish and Priscilla, a flicker of something, fear or perhaps merely annoyance, crossing his face before he smoothed it into a mask of bored indifference. "Constable," Vane Tempest called out, his voice a smooth London drawl. "I hear there's been a bit of a tragedy at the tea-room. Dreadful business. I suppose the village will be quite dull without its resident spy." "Dull for some, sir," Hamish replied, his voice slow and heavy with the Highland burr, "but a bit safer for others, I imagine. Did you manage to get your tea this morning, or did the excitement spoil your appetite?" Vane Tempest stiffened, his fingers tightening on the lapel of his jacket. "I found the atmosphere at the Gilded Thistle rather stifling, so I stayed here. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Hamish said, standing up and whistling for lugs. "It's a funny thing about Peter Ness. He died right as he was about to sign a contract. I'm just wondering who the other party was." As Hamish left, he felt Vane Tempest's eyes burning into his back. He had poked the nest. Now he just had to wait and see which wasp flew out first. But as he reached the door, he noticed something on the floor near the umbrella stand, a small, crushed leaf, dark green and waxy. He picked it up and sniffed. The scent of bitter almonds was unmistakable. The waxy leaf felt like a cold coin of truth pressed into Hamish's palm as he stepped out of the hotel and back into the biting Sutherland wind. He tucked the fragment of laurel into his pocket, his mind whirring beneath his sodden cap. If Vane Tempest had dropped that leaf, then the poison hadn't come from a chemist's cabinet. It had come from the very gardens surrounding the hotel, where the ornamental hedges were heavy with the toxic alkaloids Peter Ness had ingested. Hamish's slow, rhythmic trudge took him back toward the village centre, where the blue lights of the police vans were still pulsing like a headache against the grey sky. As he neared the tea-room, he saw a commotion that made his heart sink. DCI Blair was standing on the pavement, his chest puffed out like a territorial pigeon, while two of his constables were roughly hauling a man toward the back of a van. It was Archie McLean, the local poacher. Archie was a man whose soul was made of Highland mist and stolen salmon, but he was as incapable of cold-blooded murder as a newborn lamb. "I've got him, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, spotting Hamish. "The motive is as clear as day. We found a set of Peter Ness's binoculars in McLean's shed. The old busybody must have caught Archie poaching on the Halbert and Smythe estate, and McLean decided to silence him before he could go to the factory. It's a classic case of peasant vengeance." Archie looked at Hamish, his weathered face pale with shock. "I didn't do it, Hamish. I found those binoculars in the heather weeks ago. I never went near the tea-room. Quiet, you criminal scum!" Blair barked, shoving Archie toward the open doors of the van. "We found the murder weapon too, a bottle of homemade elderberry wine in his larder. It's probably laced with every rot-gut poison known to man. I'm taking him to Strathbane for a full confession. Case closed, and before tea time, no thanks to you." Hamish stood perfectly still, his hazel eyes fixed on the scene. He looked at Archie's boots, caked in peat and mud, entirely wrong for the clean white floors of the Gilded Thistle. Then he looked at Blair's triumphant, sweating face. "It's a grand theory, sir," Hamish said, his voice coming out in a slow, respectful drawl. "But there's a small hitch. Archie here hasn't been in the village all morning. He was up at the High Burn, checking his—" Well, checking the water levels, Mrs. Kennedy saw him pass her cottage at 10, and Peter was already in the tea room by then. "Lies!" Blair screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of violet. "They're all together. It's a conspiracy of silence. I'm arresting him, and if you say another word, Macbeth, I'll have your badge for breakfast." The van doors slammed shut, and Blair's convoy roared away, leaving Hamish alone in the rain once more. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He knew Archie was innocent, but Blair's obsession with a quick win meant the real killer was currently sitting in the hotel, probably sipping a celebratory malt. Hamish walked back to the tea room entrance where the forensics team was finally packing up. He noticed something Blair had completely missed in his rush to glory. Near the corner booth where Peter had died, tucked under the edge of the radiator, was a small white silk tassel. It was identical to the ones Hamish had seen on the Honourable Mr. Vane Tempest's expensive shooting jacket. The killer hadn't just been in the room, he had leaned over the table, likely to drop the poison into the cup or to retrieve the incriminating black book, and in his haste he'd snagged his finery on the rough metal of the heater. Hamish knelt down, pretending to tie his lace, and pocketed the tassel, the green leaf in one pocket, the white tassel in the other. The peasant had the proof, but the detective had the prisoner. He knew he couldn't just present this to Blair. The man would likely flush the evidence down the toilet rather than admit he'd arrested the wrong man. He needed something more. He needed to find out what was in those Glasgow parcels that Peter Ness had been so interested in, and he needed to do it before Vane Tempest realized the village constable wasn't as thick as he appeared to be. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his eyes turning toward the old jetty. "I think it's time we did a bit of poaching ourselves. But we're not looking for fish this time." The old jetty at the edge of Lochdubh was a skeletal remains of a more prosperous fishing era, its salt-crusted timbers groaning as the rising tide surged beneath them. The rain had turned into a stinging sleet that whipped across the water, but Hamish moved through the gorse with the practiced silence of a predator. He knew every loose stone and every treacherous patch of mud. Beside him, Lugs was a low white shadow, his instincts honed by years of illicit midnight excursions. As they neared the ruined boathouse, the silhouette of a man appeared, hunched against the wind. He was hauling a heavy rectangular crate from beneath a pile of rotted lobster creels. Even in the gloom, Hamish recognized the distinctive, agitated movements of Julian Vane Tempest. The honourable gentleman was no longer the picture of aristocratic calm. He was sweating despite the cold, his silk scarf trailing in the muck as he struggled with the weight of his burden. Hamish watched from behind a rusted winch. Vane Tempest pried open the lid of the crate with a crowbar, and the beam of a small torch revealed the contents. It wasn't gold or jewels, but a collection of ancient, weathered stone carvings, fragments of Celtic crosses and delicate Pictish slabs. Hamish felt a surge of cold anger. These were the antiques Priscilla had mentioned, but they weren't forged. They were stolen from the remote, unguarded kirkyards of the far north, stripped from the heritage of the Highlands to be sold to private collectors in the city. This was what Peter Ness had seen. The village gossip hadn't just discovered a scandal, he had discovered a systematic looting of the past. The Black Book wouldn't have contained whispers of affairs, but dates, times, and perhaps the registration number of the Glasgow van. Vane Tempest wasn't just a murderer, he was a grave robber in a shooting jacket. The green laurel leaf and white silk tassel now made sense. Vane Tempest had likely met Peter in the tea room, pretending to negotiate a price for the man's silence. While the proprietor was distracted by the aesthetic of her windows, he had slipped the concentrated laurel extract into Peter's tea. The poison, acting quickly on a man who had likely just finished a vigorous walk, would have looked like a sudden stroke or heart attack to anyone as arrogant and impatient as DCI Blair. Vane Tempest began to drag the crate toward the water's edge, his intention clear. He was going to dump the evidence before Blair's men could widen their search. But his foot slipped on a patch of slick algae, and he let out a sharp, aristocratic curse that carried over the wind. In his struggle to regain his balance, a small dark object fell from his inner pocket and skittered across the wet wood, landing near the edge of the jetty. It was a small leather-bound notebook, Peter Ness's black book. Hamish's hand tightened on Lug's collar to keep the dog from barking. He could end it now, confront the man, take the book, and face the consequences of a messy arrest. But he knew Blair. If Hamish marched Vane Tempest into the station now, Blair would claim the honourable guest was being harassed by a jealous local and might even let him go just to spite Hamish. No, he needed Vane Tempest to reveal himself in a way that even Blair's ego couldn't ignore. He needed to set a trap that played on the man's desperation and his utter contempt for the stupid people of Lochdubh. Hamish slowly backed away into the shadows of the pines, his mind already weaving the threads of a rumour that would travel through the village faster than the sleet. He would give Vane Tempest a reason to return to the tea room, a reason that involved the one thing a thief could never leave behind, the proof of his own cleverness. "Come, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the hazel light in his eyes turning sharp and cold. "We have a bit of gossip to spread. By the time the sun goes down, Mr. Vane Tempest is going to find out that the Information Bureau has one last secret to tell from beyond the grave." The sleet continued to lash against the window of the post office as Hamish leaned over the counter, his face a mask of weary local concern. Mrs. Kennedy was sorting the afternoon mail, her eyes sharp and attentive. He knew that in Lochdubh a secret told to the postmistress was a secret broadcast to the entire parish within the hour. It was the most efficient communications network in the Highlands, and Hamish was about to tap into its full power. "It's a terrible thing about Archie McLean," Hamish said, sighing as he adjusted his damp cap. "The DCI is convinced he did it, but the forensics boys, well, they found something hidden into the upholstery of Peter's booth. A small digital recorder. Seems Peter was a bit more modern than we thought. He recorded his last conversation." Mrs. Kennedy froze, a bundle of letters mid-air. "A recording? You mean his voice is on it, and the killer's?" "Aye," Hamish whispered, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "But the battery's flat. They've left it in the tea room overnight to let it warm up before they try to play it tomorrow morning. Blair thinks it'll be Archie's voice, but I have my doubts. I told the DCI it should be moved to the station, but he said nobody would be foolish enough to break into a crime scene with a police guard on the street." He knew Vane Tempest was likely lurking nearby, or would hear of this discovery within minutes of Mrs. Kennedy telling the hotel barman. The honourable gentleman was already on edge. The thought of his own voice detailing a transaction for stolen Pictish stones would be enough to send him into a terminal panic. Hamish left the shop, whistling softly for Lugs, and made his way back to his station house. He didn't go inside to rest. Instead, he gathered a heavy woolen blanket, a thermos of black coffee, and a very sturdy length of rope. By 10 o'clock that night, Lochdubh village was as dark as a pocket. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a cold, biting mist that clung to the eaves of the houses. The gilded thistle sat silent and white, its large glass windows reflecting the pale glow of a single street lamp. Blair's police guard consisted of a lone, shivering constable named Anderson, who was currently sitting in the warmth of a patrol car 50 yards down the road, his head nodding in the rhythmic pull of sleep. Hamish was already inside the tea room. He had let himself in through the back kitchen door, a lock he knew was as flimsy as a biscuit tin, and was now crouched behind the very counter where Mrs. St. John Smythe usually presided over her overpriced infusions. He didn't have a digital recorder. In its place he had set a small rectangular block of wood wrapped in a silk handkerchief, positioned prominently on the corner table. Hours passed. Hamish's legs began to ache, but he remained as still as the Sutherland Mountains. He listened to the silence, his ears tuned to the subtle shift in the wind. Lugs were outside, hidden beneath a bench, serving as a silent sentry. Suddenly, a soft scraping sound came from the back. The kitchen door creaked, a protest of old wood that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. A figure moved into the main room, illuminated by the ghostly light from the street. It was Julian Vane Tempest. He wasn't wearing his shooting jacket now. He was dressed in dark city clothes, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He moved toward the corner booth, his eyes darting toward the street where the patrol car sat. He saw the silk-wrapped object on the table and let out a strangled, triumphant hiss. As his hand reached for the block of wood, Hamish rose slowly from behind the counter, the beam of his heavy police torch cutting through the dark like a blade. "I'm afraid the battery is still flat, Mr. Vane Tempest," Hamish drawled, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "But then again, wood rarely has much to say for itself." Vane Tempest spun around, his face a mask of raw aristocratic terror. He didn't surrender. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, the crowbar he had used at the jetty. "You!" he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You stupid ginger-haired peasant, you think you can trap me?" "I don't think so, sir," Hamish said, stepping around the counter with a deceptive cat-like lightness. "I know it, and I think Archie McLean is going to be very pleased to see you." The white, minimalist walls of the tea-room seemed to close in as Vane Tempest lunged, the crowbar whistling through the air with a lethal intent that belied his refined upbringing. Hamish, however, was no longer the slouching, slow-witted constable the village had come to expect. He moved with a startling fluid economy, stepping inside the arc of the swing and catching Vane Tempest's wrist in a grip that felt like iron bands. The honourable gentleman let out a gasp of pain, his eyes widening as he realised he had vastly underestimated the physical strength of the man he had dismissed as a peasant. Now, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "There's no need to be ruining the furniture. Mrs. St. John Smythe is very particular about her aesthetic." Vane Tempest, fueled by a frantic, cornered energy, didn't give up easily. He used his free hand to shove Hamish backward, sending him stumbling into a display of fragile artisanal teapots. The crash of porcelain shattered the silence of the village, and the sound was enough to finally rouse Constable Anderson from his slumber down the road. Vane Tempest saw his opening and bolted toward the back door, his silk scarf trailing behind him like a white flag of surrender that he refused to acknowledge. He burst into the damp night, his boots skidding on the wet cobbles of the alleyway. He thought he had the advantage of speed, but he hadn't reckoned on the Highland fog or the shadows. As he rounded the corner toward the old jetty, hoping to reach his car, or perhaps lose himself in the gorse, a low, white blur streaked across his path. Lugs, who had been waiting patiently in the dark, let out a sharp, authoritative bark and nipped at the man's ankles with surgical precision. Vane Tempest stumbled, his arms windmilling as he tried to keep his balance on the slick timbers of the pier. Before he could recover, Hamish was upon him. The constable didn't use a baton or a weapon. He simply used the weight and momentum of a man who had spent his life climbing Sutherland peaks. He tackled Vane Tempest into a pile of damp, discarded fishing nets, the heavy cordage entangling the thief like the very web of lies he had woven. "Let go of me, you savage!" Vane Tempest shrieked, his voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Do you have any idea who I am? My family has connections that could have you walking a beat in the Shetlands for the rest of your miserable life. I doubt your family has much use for a grave robber and a poisoner," Hamish panted, pinning the man's arms behind his back with practised ease. He pulled the length of rope from his tunic and began to secure Vane Tempest's wrists. "And as for the Shetlands, I hear the fishing is quite grand this time of year, though I'd much rather stay here in Lochdubh." Just as the final knot was tightened, the glare of headlights flooded the jetty. Blair's black sedan and 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt, their sirens finally wailing in a belated chorus of authority. Blair practically tumbled out of the car, his face a mask of bewildered rage as he saw his sidelined constable sitting atop the Honourable Mr. Vane Tempest. "Macbeth, what is the meaning of this?" Blair roared, his heels clattering on the wooden planks. "I told you to direct traffic. Why are you assaulting a hotel guest?" This is an international incident. I'll have your head for this." Hamish rose slowly, brushing salt and dirt from his trousers. He looked at Blair with an expression of pure, unadulterated gormlessness. "I'm sorry, sir. Truly I am. I was just out for a walk with Lugs when I saw this gentleman trying to break into the tea room. I thought he might be looking for more of that lemon cake, but then I found this in his pocket." Hamish reached down and produced Peter Ness's black book, along with a small glass vial of concentrated laurel extract he had recovered from Vane Tempest's inner pocket during the struggle. "It seems he was the one Peter was meeting, sir. And look there, in the back of his car." He pointed to the trunk of the silver Mercedes, which had been left slightly ajar in Van Tempest's haste. The light from the police cars illuminated the jagged edges of the stolen Pictish stones. Blair froze. His jaw dropped, and for a moment the only sound was the lapping of the loch against the pilings. He looked at the book, the poison, and the ancient carvings. The realization that he was standing in the middle of a massive career-making bust, and that he had nearly arrested an innocent poacher instead, began to settle behind his bulging eyes. Hamish saw the shift in Blair's expression. He knew the DCI was already calculating how to turn this mess into a personal victory. "It was a brilliant plan of yours, sir," Hamish offered in a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Using me as a decoy while you secretly monitored the jetty. I'm just glad I could play my part in your investigation." Blair's chest expanded with such sudden force that Hamish half expected the buttons of his blazer to fly off into the dark waters of the loch. The DCI's face transitioned from a panicked purple to a smug, self-satisfied crimson in the space of a single heartbeat. He looked at the bound and dishevelled Van Tempest, then at the stolen Pictish stones, and finally at Hamish with a look that was almost, but not quite, affectionate. It was the look a man gives a particularly useful, if slightly dim-witted, shovel. "Yes, well," Blair huffed, adjusting his tie and stepping over the tangled fishing nets to loom over the prisoner. "It was a complex operation, Macbeth. High-level strategy. I knew that by letting you play the fool, the suspect would become overconfident. It takes a seasoned detective to know when to use a local element as bait. You didn't mess it up too badly, I suppose." Vane Tempest let out a muffled snarl of protest, but Blair ignored him, turning instead to the huddle of junior detectives who were now swarming the jetty with renewed vigour. "Get these artefacts secured, and someone gets a statement from Macbeth here before he forgets what day it is. I need to get a telephone. The Chief Constable will want a full briefing on how I personally cracked the Lochdubh antiquities ring." Hamish stood back, his shoulders slumped in a posture of weary subservience. "As you say, sir. It's great to see justice done so quickly. I'll just head back to the station and see about releasing Archie McLean. I imagine he's had a long enough night in the cells." Blair waved a hand dismissively. "Yes, yes. Let the poacher go. Tell him he owes his freedom to my diligent pursuit of the facts. If it weren't for my intervention, he'd be halfway to a life sentence by now." Hamish nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground to hide the small private twinkle of amusement. He whistled for Lugs, and the two of them turned away from the shouting, the flashing lights, and the heavy atmosphere of a big city investigation. They walked slowly back toward the village, the mist curling around them like a protective shroud. By the time they reached the main street, the lights of the police cars were mere flickers in the distance, and the silence of the Highlands had begun to reclaim its territory. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds in a rare display of golden brilliance, turning the puddles on the road into shimmering mirrors. Hamish sat at his kitchen table, the peat stove humming a warm rhythmic tune. He was nursing a fresh pot of coffee, the steam rising to meet the rafters of the old station house. Lugs was sprawled across his feet, twitching in his sleep as he presumably chased aristocratic thieves through a dreamscape of sausages and shortbread. A knock at the door signalled Priscilla's arrival. She walked in carrying a newspaper, her expression one of amused resignation. "It's official, Hamish," she said, tossing the paper onto the table. "DCI Blair is the hero of the hour. There's a photograph of him holding Peter Ness's black book as if it were the crown jewels. Not a single mention of a red-haired constable or a West Highland terrier." Hamish glanced at the headline, "Strathbane Detective Cracks Highland Murder and Looting Ring," and felt a deep, profound sense of contentment. "It's a beautiful thing, Priscilla. If they'd mentioned me, I'd be halfway to a promotion in Glasgow by now. I'd be wearing a suit that itches and sitting in an office that smells of stale cigarette smoke and despair. Instead, I have my coffee, my dog, and a village that's just a little bit quieter than it was yesterday." "And what about Mrs. St. John Smythe?" Priscilla asked, helping herself to a cup of coffee. "I hear she's decided to move back to London. She says the Highland vibe is too aggressive for her sensibilities." Hamish smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Well, Lochdubh has a way of sorting people. Some are meant for the mist, and some are just passing through." He looked out the window at the loch, where a single heron was perched on a rock, watching the water with a stillness that Hamish deeply respected. The case was closed, the secret looter was behind bars, and the Information Bureau of Peter Ness had finally filed its last report. Life in the Highlands was returning to its slow, natural rhythm, and for Hamish Macbeth, there was no greater victory than being allowed to remain a part of it. He reached for a piece of toast, happy to be exactly where he was, the laziest, smartest man in the county, with nothing to do but wait for the next pot of coffee to brew. The golden sunlight did not last, of course. This was the Highlands after all. By the afternoon, the sky had bruised into a deep, moody purple, and a light mist began to roll off the Atlantic, reclaiming the hills of Sutherland. Hamish stood by the window of his station, watching the village return to its ancient, unhurried pace. Across the road, he could see the closed sign still hanging on the door of the Gilded Thistle. It was a strange sight to see the place empty of Peter Ness's peering face and Mrs. St. John Smythe's frantic hand-wringing, but it brought a certain peace to the street that had been missing for weeks. Luggs gave a low, questioning woof from his position by the stove. Hamish turned, realizing his stomach was voicing a similar complaint. The adrenaline of the previous night had worn off, leaving behind a hollow ache that only a proper Highland stew could fill. He set a heavy iron pot on the stove, beginning the slow process of chopping potatoes and onions. There was no rush. The world of DCI Blair was one of sirens and deadlines, but in Hamish's kitchen, the only clock that mattered was the one that told him when the meat was tender. As the savoury scent of the stew began to fill the room, the telephone gave a solitary, timid chirp. Hamish sighed, wiping his hands on a tea towel. He picked up the receiver, prepared to hear Blair's booming voice demanding more paperwork, but the voice on the other end was soft and distinctly local. It was Mary, the tea room's kitchen maid. "Constable, I'm sorry to bother you, but I went back to the shop to gather my things. Mrs. St. John Smythe is packing her bags at the hotel and told me to clear the larder." Her voice trembled slightly. "I found something, Hamish, behind the flour sacks. It's a small leather book. It looks like the one Peter Ness always carried, but it's not the one the inspector took away last night." Hamish's grip on the receiver tightened. "Stay there, Mary. Don't touch it any more than you already have. I'll be there in 2 minutes." He grabbed his greatcoat and whistled for Luggs, leaving the stew to simmer. The walk to the tea room took less than 60 seconds. Inside, the air was still and smelled faintly of lavender and stale cake. Mary was standing by the back counter, holding a small weathered ledger that looked almost identical to the black book Blair had so triumphantly displayed to the press. "He must have had 2 of them," Hamish muttered, taking the book gently from her. One for the secrets he wanted people to pay for, and one for the secrets that were too dangerous to even talk about. He flipped open the pages. The handwriting was cramped and frantic. It wasn't about Van Tempest's stolen stones. It was a list of names, local names, people from Lochdubh and the surrounding glens. Beside each name was a date and a numerical figure. But it wasn't a blackmail list. As Hamish read further, his heart began to sink. It was a record of a local investment scheme, a private fund Peter Ness had been managing for the villagers to protect them from the very outsiders he pretended to despise. The final entry was dated the day before his death. It showed a massive withdrawal, a sum of money that would have drained the life savings of half the village. And the signature at the bottom of the transaction wasn't Peter's. It was a name that caught Hamish's breath in his throat, Mrs. Kennedy. Hamish looked at the empty room, the white tables standing like gravestones. He realized now that Vane Tempest had been a convenient shadow. The honourable thief had certainly been there, and he had certainly been stealing stones, but he might not have been the one to drop the poison. Peter Ness had been betrayed not just by a city criminal, but by one of his own, someone who knew his habits, his tea-time rituals, and exactly how much he had stolen from the people who trusted him. "Thank you, Mary," Hamish said softly, tucking the book into his inner pocket. "Go home now, and Mary, tell no one about this. Not a soul." He stepped out into the mist, the weight of the book feeling heavier than the iron pot back at the station. He knew he couldn't take this to Blair. If he did, the entire village would be ruined, their secrets bared to a man who would use them for sport. He had to handle this the Lochdubh way. He turned his steps toward the post office, where a single light still burned in the window. The bell above the post office door gave a cheerful, brassy tinkle that felt entirely at odds with the gravity of the black book in Hamish's pocket. The shop was empty of its usual queue, the air smelling of ink, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of Mrs. Kennedy's lavender water. She was behind the counter, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she meticulously entered figures into a ledger. "Hamish," she said, not looking up, "I heard the news. DCI Blair is taking the credit as usual, and that awful Vane Tempest man is behind bars. A victory for the law, I suppose." "Aye," Hamish replied, his voice soft, almost a whisper. He leaned against the counter, his hazel eyes fixed on the woman he had known his entire life. "Blair has his thief, he has his poisoner, he has his promotion. It's a very tidy ending for everyone in Strathbane." Mrs. Kennedy finally looked up, her blue eyes sharp behind the glass. "But not for you, Hamish. You look as though you've swallowed a stone." "I found Peter's other book, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, sliding the small weathered ledger onto the counter, "the one he kept behind the flour sacks, the one that tells the story of how he didn't just spy on people, but how he looked after their money. Or was supposed to." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. Mrs. Kennedy's hand, which had been reaching for a stamp, stilled. She didn't look at the book. She looked at Hamish, and in that moment the mask of the respectable village postmistress slipped, revealing a tired, grieving woman. "He was going to take it all, Hamish," she said, her voice cracking. "The pension money for the McRaes, the savings for the schoolteacher's operation. He told me he was moving it to a safer offshore account, but I saw the ticket for the ferry to Ireland on his desk. He was leaving us. He was leaving the people who had given him their trust because they were too afraid of the modern world to go to a real bank." "So you met him at the tea room," Hamish mused, his mind filling in the final gaps. "Vane Tempest was there to blackmail him, yes, but he was merely a distraction. You brought him a special infusion from your garden, didn't you? A little laurel extract to help with his nerves." "I didn't want him to die," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wanted him to stay long enough for me to get the ledger back, to return the money. But he drank it so fast, Hamish, and when he fell I panicked. I took the ledger I thought was the only one, and I let the world believe it was Vane Tempest. The man was a criminal anyway. What did one more sin matter to him?" Hamish looked at the ledger, then at the woman who had once baked him ginger nuts when he was a lonely boy. If he arrested her, the scandal would destroy the village. The money would be tied up in legal battles for years, and the people of Lochdubh would lose everything. "The money is all back in the accounts, Mrs. Kennedy?" Hamish asked. "Every penny. I spent all night at the computer using his passwords. The villagers won't even know it was ever gone." Hamish picked up the black book. He walked over to the small coal stove in the corner of the post office, used to heat the shop in winter. He opened the door, watched the orange glow of the embers, and dropped the ledger inside. The pages curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. "Peter Ness died of a heart attack brought on by the stress of being blackmailed by a London criminal," Hamish said firmly, turning back to her. "That is what the official record says, and that is what DCI Blair believes. And we both know that once the DCI believes something, the truth hasn't a chance in hell of changing his mind." Mrs. Kennedy let out a long, shuddering breath. "Thank you, Hamish. Just see that the lavender water stays for the letters, Mrs. Kennedy, and the laurel stays in the hedge," Hamish said, touching his cap. He stepped back out into the mist, lugs trotting faithfully at his side. He returned to his station, where the stew was now bubbling away, thick and rich. He poured himself a bowl, sat in his armchair, and watched the fog swallow the village. The secret of Lochdubh was safe. The lazy policeman had ensured that the peace remained, even if the price was a secret he would carry to his grave. As he took a spoonful of the hot stew, he felt a sense of profound, quiet victory. He was still in his village. He was still the man who did nothing, and in the Highlands, sometimes doing nothing was the hardest and most important job of all.